Well, he's already introduced you to that reason. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Sarwat Hussain to you this morning. He actually doesn't need any introduction. He's a Hyderabadi. He belongs to an old Nawadi family of Hyderabad. He's a long-time friend of ICRISAT. In fact, he worked at ICRISAT in the 70s and 80s. But for those who haven't yet met Sarwat, who haven't kept up with his spectacular rise in his career, let me tell you, I have to read what he wrote because it's a mouthful. Sarwat is now the head of Sustainable Development Communications in the World Bank's Africa region. He specializes in project communications for key sectors, and they are agriculture, energy, environment, transport, urban development, water, and sanitation, among others. Are there any left? I mean, the list is so long. And he works closely with the bank's operational task teams, including outreach to communities and civil society groups, thus helping to advance the bank's knowledge-sharing agenda. He has just completed a 3-year bank assignment in Pretoria, where he supported the bank's country teams in South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, and Swaziland. During this assignment, he worked on the $3.75 billion ESCOM Investment Support Project and the ESCOM Renewables Support Project, the largest World Bank investments in its 60-year-plus history. Ladies and gentlemen, I now turn over the floor to Sarwat.
Thank you so much, Lydia. This is
You're most welcome.
a very gracious invitation, and I'm very honored to be back here. My office used to be right upstairs, so I'm a son of the soil, need little introduction. Spent the bulk of my life on these alphisols and vertisols. Learned all my development tricks here, and I've spent the past 20 years at the World Bank. I've just completed 20 years, so I cut my development teeth here. And I think this is the place to which I owe an enormous intellectual debt. So with that, delighted to be back, and thank you so much, Lydia, for that very generous introduction. I'm sorry I'm late, but I'll try and speak quick, and what I will do is leave a PDF of my presentation. It's fully referenced. I'll leave it with Lydia so you can have access to it after the presentation. This is going to be the outline of my presentation. Of course, it's all focused on Africa, which is the region that I work in. 49 countries, fastest growth, and I'll have numbers to back it up. We are talking about ending poverty and boosting shared prosperity in our lifetimes. It is about unleashing the power of agribusiness. That's one of the segments of the presentation. Thank you so much. And we've got the biggest issue, I think, between agriculture and land. These are the two major defining issues of our time. Why is that important? Because, as I show later, Africa is home to the largest tracts of unfertilized, uncultivated land. There's now a global rush for Africa's farmland, and again, I'll speak about that a little bit later. And I just wanted to, because I work in public affairs at the World Bank, I just wanted to share some thoughts about how perceptions about Africa are changing. So with that, let's give you a quick overview of our changing world. Africa has faced 3 episodes of growth. The period of the 1960s, all through the way to 1976, which is when I started work at ICRISAT. It was a period of sluggish growth, followed by 3 decades that were the lost, at least the development literature is replete with examples of how Africa missed the bus during those the last decades. And they were indeed the lost decades as they're referenced. And now is catch-up time, because Africa is the fastest growing continent just now. Fortunately, thanks to development work, thanks to the work of the CGIAR, and thanks to all the global effort, poverty rates have been falling, and that's the global sort of pattern, a downward trend. All of us know that the Millennium Development Goals are due by 2050. Africa and some parts, or very large parts of Africa, are not on schedule to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. And the trend for Africa started late and started slowest. And that's the yellow line that you see there, right there. Well, things are changing. If you were to look at the engines of growth just now in the global economy, you would very quickly see that most countries are having growth rates that would be the envy of the developing world, envy of the industrialized world. And we are looking at sizzling growth rates of above 5 to 10, anywhere between 5 to 10%. And those are absolutely way above the charts compared to the global economy and compared to what's happening in, let's say, the United States or in Europe, where we have anemic growth rates of less than 2%. The World Bank has new leadership. We are very cognizant of the fact that the Millennium Development Goals, some of them will be achieved. The major one on poverty will not be achieved. And so what we have done is we've retooled our mission and statement of purpose to say that we want to end extreme poverty, and that means the percentage of people living with less than $1.25 a day to fall to no more than 3% globally by 2030. So we're saying 97% of poverty as we know it should be alleviated. And then we also we know that economic growth is just not enough for ending poverty. So the idea is to promote shared prosperity. And there we are looking at fostering income growth for the bottom 40% of the population in every developing country. Those are the new goals. We've got a first time, and this is absolutely relevant to ICRISAT, is that for the first time in the bank's history, we have a scientist who is the president. It's a Korean physician. His name is Jim Yong Kim. He was appointed by President Obama. He has a PhD in anthropology. He first did 6 years of medical school, earned his MD at Harvard Medical School. He said, I've learned what it is to heal, but I haven't understood what drives people. So he went back and did another 4 years of anthropology. So he has a MD and a PhD, which is a very unusual combination. And I had the privilege of escorting him to South Africa on his trip and so forth. So I took him on his first trip to the African continent. We are here to talk about agribusiness, and I think all of us here are involved. I mean, small farmers are the quintessential private sector. Beating the odds, making do with very little inputs, braving the elements, that's the life of a small farmer. I don't have to say more than that here. But the good news is, why should we focus now on Africa? The news is that there's a strong macro policy environment. More countries are facing economic growth. More countries are recognizing that they've paid the price for not pursuing economic reforms that have helped to transform the rural development and the farm economy. And there is increasing attention to agriculture from both governments, investors, and stakeholders, including the World Bank. A guy called Derek Byerly did the 2008 World Development Report on agriculture. He is the lead author on this agribusiness, so I better not take any intellectual credit for this work. I'm just the ambassador or the storyteller from the report. But Derek Byerly did most of the work, and then there was another consultant, Asa Giertz and Tugba Gurjanlar from Turkey and so forth. So there was a large group of people that worked on this project. The big news is that Africa's food markets are poised for unprecedented growth. We are looking at the current market value of the food markets is around $313 billion. We are looking for that to shoot up all the way to $1 trillion by 2030. I mean, and this is driven very, very largely by Africa's sizzling rates of urbanization. Africa is the fastest growing continent. It is the fastest urbanizing continent, second only to, in the long span of history, Latin America was first, but now Africa has overtaken it. The growth rates are anywhere between 3.9% to 4% annually. So the inexorable march of Africans to cities is taking place right now. And that is driving up this tremendous growth in the food markets. It's a fantastic opportunity because it's driven by population growth, by income growth, by urbanization. African production has lagged, and that's very clear from this thing where food consumption has risen, but agricultural production has not kept pace. So there is a potential to increase yields, the kind of work that you do. There's the reduction of post-harvest losses and so forth, which is about 20% anywhere. But the greater opportunity is about structural transformation of the economy. And that is what we have to achieve. And that can be agribusiness, a thriving agricultural economy, a thriving agribusiness sector can help us achieve that transformation. Now, just in the nearly 20 years that I've been working in development, one of the biggest issues that has been cited about Africa's lack of progress has been its untapped irrigation potential. Only anywhere between 2 to 5% of Africa's abundant water resources have been tapped. All the big hydro schemes and so forth that were put in place in Asia and so forth, and which helped propel the green revolution and so forth, those have largely bypassed Africa. And here you have this is a map, a scaled up map of where, and this draws on IFPRI's work on looking at the potential. And what the bank is doing is saying that in the next 10 to 15 years, we want to double the area under irrigation, because that is one of the single largest binding constraints to agricultural expansion. I think there's some water there, isn't it? Can I just... So if the future, so then we might ask the rhetorical question, so if the future is so bright, why is it not happening? And what is holding us back, and what would it take to get us from here to there? From this 313 billion all the way to the $1 trillion opportunity that we talked about. Clearly, we know from the development literature that agricultural transformation in Africa has been slow. Yields are nearly 1/2 or 1/3 of those achieved in Asia and Latin America and so forth, and there are numbers to back that up. But the key question is that if you're looking at agribusiness, you're looking at a wider set of sectors that are impacted. So for example, access to capital is a binding constraint. Competitiveness of agriculture is a major issue. And all of those, the solutions for that lie in the policy agenda that frequently falls outside the limited agricultural or rural development sector. And of course, we know too that rural development as a sector, as a topic, most of the votes are in urban areas. Most of what happens in capitals has policy implications. And as a rule, almost as a rule, policies have tended to bypass rural areas. We know that from the work of when we were in the economics program, doing the work on the VLS, as Cynthia and Partha are there, and Jagdish I saw somewhere, and so forth. So the issue there is that by and large, vote banks exist only in urban areas, to the detriment of rural people. Clearly here, when you compare sub-Saharan Africa to amazing transformations that have taken place in Brazil. So for example, at the CGIAR Secretariat, I used to work with Francisco Reifschneider, who was head of international relations at Embrapa, which is the Brazilian national program. And the transformation in Brazil is one of the most amazing stories on earth absolutely in human history, nothing as dramatic has happened, because the transformation of the Cerrado, which was their semi-arid tropics, has now made them into an agricultural powerhouse, the largest provider of soybeans, the largest provider of livestock and meat products to North American markets, and so forth. So if we look at, let's say, China, which is absolutely amazing also in how dramatically they've been able to improve their farm economy, you're looking at China, which feeds about 20% of the world's population, using only 7% of the agricultural area. The point about all of that is that that revolution has bypassed sub-Saharan Africa. Today, Thailand exports more food products than all of sub-Saharan Africa combined. Just one small country produces more and exports more than all African countries combined. And we are calling for this position to change. Low yields, I mean, of course, the entire group sitting here is addressing the issue of low yields. I must say I had the privilege of working with Dr. John Monteith when he was here, and Dr. Monteith worked at the Rothamsted experimental station in the UK, which is home to the Broadbach long-term fertility experiment. It is the longest production assessment program where they have historical records going back to about 1100 years. And the Broadbach experiment is cited in development literature as being the best example of how to look at long-term fertility and yield results. And Dr. Monteith, of course, had worked there. The issue about African yields, I mean, as this graph shows, sub-Saharan Africa is at the bottom of the growth trend. The thing is that, and of course, much of this is because grain science, as we know it, has bypassed Africa. If you look at the story about agricultural transformation, there's one set of numbers that I can cite to you. It took 1,000 years for wheat yields to rise from 0.2 to 2 tons per hectare. When scientists started to look at the yield potential and started to invest in increasing yields, it took only 40 years for those yields to rise from 2 to 4 metric tons per hectare. What hadn't happened in 1,000 years was compressed in 40 years. And the point about that is that that potential is yet to be realized in sub-Saharan Africa. Despite its great potential, sub-Saharan African agribusiness is lagging, and there are whole issues of total factor productivity growth, irrigation, and then distortionary policies. And by distortionary policies, what I'm saying is that, while there's been a lot of research done on total factor productivity and so forth, much less has been done about looking at how policies have distorted agriculture. I mean, the World Bank had its own role. We've been pilloried for imposing our structural adjustment policies during the 1980s. All the entire decade of the 1980s through the 2000s was where we imposed structural adjustment programs, and we really got a bad rap for doing that because we failed to look at the social dimensions of adjustment that was taking place. And Cynthia, all of this is on the web, so it would be very interesting for you and your team to look at this. And the question then is, in terms of diagnostics, why are we headed in the wrong direction? As I said, these erratic and distorting policies, for example, even currently in Ghana on rice, they produce the largest varieties of rice in West Africa, but they impose a 40% tariff, which just makes price of rice shoot up. And then again, there are whole issues of quality and so forth. Senegal is the same. It is the rice basket of West Africa, but again, facing huge issues in terms of access to land and capital and all of that, which I spoke about earlier. Weak land markets, that's a whole section in my presentation. The global headlines are about Africa's land grab. I can share with you a personal vignette. I used to be based in South Africa and looking at the program in Madagascar. In 2010, what Madagascar decided to do was lease about 500,000 hectares of land to Daewoo, the Korean corporation. And the idea was very simple. We'll take over this land about half the size of Belgium. We'll grow palm oil, we'll grow rice, and we'll bring in labor and expertise from Japan and everywhere else, including Chinese labor. And we'll have one of the most productive farms in all of Africa to sort of, shore up local production, provide local jobs, and so forth. Well, nothing is very simple if you're dealing with issues of land. The deal was struck by the government with the corporation. It totally ignored local property rights. What happened was absolutely incredible, and this is a story that is yet to be written in development literature, is that there was a coup that took place. There was an opponent who was very media savvy, so he took to the airwaves, including radio, and deposed this government of Mark Ravalomanana and said that, this corporation Daewoo is going to rob us of our land, deprive us of our natural resources, and this thing has been done under very opaque circumstances. There was a coup that took place. Mark Ravalomanana was deposed, and 4 years later, the coup is still, Madagascar remains under a transitional government, and it has seen its poverty indicators rise so dramatically. And the bank was involved in major schemes. We had to pull out because we don't finance illegal governments that have come through coups. The upshot of all of that is that Madagascar now is on the bottom list of those countries. So what happens in these transparent deals matters hugely for development, it matters hugely for people, and can really set back the development clock by decades. And Madagascar is a prime example. And all of these things on weak land markets, I'll address them in the second segment of my thing. But again, public investment in agriculture, the World Bank's World Development Report in 2008 talked about it. Our Agricultural Action Plan in 2012 has addressed some of those issues that were laid out. The whole issues of limited irrigation, transport infrastructure, and the difficulties that African farmers face in terms of access to technologies, information skills, and finance. This is a very, I'm sorry to inflict a very bad graph on you, but this looked at the major constraints faced by the value chain. We took a value chain approach, and again, Cynthia, this would be of interest to you, and Partha and the others. We looked at rice in Ghana and Senegal, as I said, maize in Zambia, cocoa in Ghana, dairy products, and then, of course, Kenya, green beans in Kenya. And we took a detailed look at all of the value chains on these major commodities and focused on how severe were the constraints that were imposed on them. And this remains one of the most detailed analysis of its type for this kind of work. If this potential has so far eluded us, the whole challenge is now to come up with a policy and investment agenda that looks at how you can unleash the power of agribusiness, which can be done by promoting greater regional integration in markets. The unwritten story is about, we released a new report called Africa Can Feed Africa, and we found that less than 10% of African countries trade on grain amongst themselves. Virtually 90% of it is bypassed. That situation needs to change. We've not, as I said, along with rising urbanization, along with rising consumer tastes, along with the market shifts in terms of consumption patterns, as countries grow more wealthy, we know that they shift towards more processed foods. We know that the shift takes place towards a greater consumption of meat and livestock and all of that. And of course, we have China's example there to quote. But Africa's supermarket revolution is yet to be harnessed. We are making these dramatic strides in ICT that are changing the face of agriculture in Africa. The whole issue of agricultural finance up till remains a barren field, and there's great potential for public-private partnerships, but those are very few and far in between. And when they do take place, there's much less that is written about them, so people don't actually know. The prospect of doubling irrigated area, I mean, I just focused on this because I'm in a SAT area and so forth, but the prospect of increasing irrigation will require about 40 billion in investments to double irrigated area by 2030. We are hosting a major conference on irrigation with the government of Senegal in October. And what we're trying to do is bring all the Sahelian countries together in Dakar on October 28th to come together with a pledge that will bring in the programs, the projects, and the policies to double irrigated area by 2030. There are various reasons for optimism. Agribusiness, as I said before, can be a stepping stone to industrialization and transformation, and the kind of deep structural transformation that is needed to alleviate poverty. Most importantly, there is growing recognition that you cannot have development without improving agriculture first, which should be good news for all of us here, because the CGI remains the only entity that brings the largest amount of public investments to bear on agricultural research needs of small farmers. And the point is that, as I said about the Brazilian Cerrado, China's success in the Los Plateau, Indonesia, Thailand, Ukraine, all of these countries have made dramatic strides in improving their agriculture, making the investment climate more friendly to agribusiness and so forth. And it is now Africa's turn. Africa's turn simply because, not by choice, not by default, but simply because Africa is home to the largest tract of uncultivated land that exists on planet Earth. A key to this aspect is securing Africa's land. And we just put out a major report based on this, which basically makes the argument about why land governance matters. All the headlines are about these major corporations going out and buying land and depriving people of their land rights. Many of them are women and so forth. So the whole idea there is to bring to bear public scrutiny on this issue. As I said, Africa has lots of land, lots of natural resources, and about 202 million hectares. It also, unfortunately, has the highest productivity gap, which is 25% of potential. I used to live in mineral-rich South Africa, which has 20% of the world's gold, 80% of the world's platinum, and so forth. But all of those resources have not yet translated into benefits for the average African. And nearly half of the population lives on $1.25 a day. And the summary of that work basically says that now is the time to look at land as an asset that can be deployed in the fight against poverty. The major finding of the study is that 90% of Africa's land is undocumented. And about half of large-scale land acquisitions are taking place in sub-Saharan Africa. It takes twice as long and costs twice as much to transfer property in sub-Saharan Africa compared to OECD countries in the industrialized world. There's deep-rooted, rampant corruption in land agencies, and this was one of the major studies by Transparency International, and they did a global study and found that Africa had the largest amounts of corruption in that particular area. There's also the capacity, the low capacity and demand for land professionals, and that needs a major retooling of the curriculum, the major effort at improving the skills and productivity of these surveyors and so forth. Again, the kind of things that the US did very early on in its land grant university system, but those lessons have largely escaped Africa. So the opportunity, it's a huge opportunity, and I think for the first time, I mean, the World Bank gets a bad rap for putting big numbers on issues, but the land governance study said that for the puny sum of 4.5 billion, we could secure Africa's land and bring, and it is puny, if you look at what the major investments are, you could bring 90% of that undocumented land back into the records for 4.5 billion. Why is that possible? Because most countries now have the basic land laws are in place, including those that recognize customary land tenure and look at gender equality. In many ways, this is the unwritten story about how African governments have actually gone ahead and put in place the rules and regulations and the laws that look at this thing. So now the challenge is to provide them the backup and support so that they can take this to the next level. The African Union Commission has its land policy guidelines. We have the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance or tenure put out by FAO, and the principles for responsible agri-investment, which are all in place. New technologies are helping to reduce costs, satellites, ICT, and there are new approaches that are being piloted and scaled up even as we speak. It's absolutely incredible, registering communal land at low cost. In Tanzania, I'm involved with what is called the Southern Agriculture Growth Project in Tanzania, which for the first time is going to be helping small farmers to legalize their access rights, legalize their land titling, and to allow them to participate in agribusiness opportunities. And there are lots of success stories. You know, Ethiopia has shown how it can do land parceling very effectively, and it has done 20 million parcels of land have been registered. The point about this is that many of these countries are taking the necessary steps and putting in the necessary infrastructure to make a difference. Rwanda is clearly, I mean, Rwanda is for the 3 years has been in the top 10 countries in which they've made the greatest strides in their doing business indicators. I mean, tiny Rwanda, who could have imagined home to, you know, that amazing genocide that took place in 1984. One of my favorite stories about Rwanda is I arrived there with a nicely packed suitcase done in plastic and made it through customs and so forth, and there was the environmental inspector there, and he said, sorry, you can't take the suitcase in. So I said, you know, I've cleared customs, what's the problem? He said, this has plastic on it, and plastic is banned in Rwanda. So they do take small strides and do things effectively. The whole issue of registering communal and individual lands, I mean, I must tell you, I was in a meeting with Oxfam, which is one of the leading NGOs, and I was sitting with our Vice President for Africa region, Mokhtar Diop. And at that meeting, the whole issue was the Oxfam was asking us to put a moratorium on land investments. And they said these land investments are not working. You need, the World Bank needs to put a moratorium on all land investments, regardless of size, regardless of location, and so forth. So Mokhtar is a former Senegalese finance minister and a very distinguished Senegalese. So when they started to talk about women's rights and so forth, he just turned around and he stood up and he said, listen, I don't want to be hectored or talking to by an NGO working on land issues. I'm Senegalese, I'm Wolof. I understand what these issues are. Senegal has made the greatest strides in making sure that its policies reflect gender equality in the land area. So please don't lecture me on an issue that I know about and about which I'm extremely familiar. Again, there are dramatic examples of how land administration is being improved in Ghana. The redistribution of land in Malawi remains a prime example, and all of this information is on the World Bank website as a success story. And you know, more of these, the big issue about as Africa urbanizes, the big issue is about how do you handle the instant slums that have sprouted up around all the major metropolises. And there the rights of squatters on public land, that remains one of the most contentious issues. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a major eviction of people in Tanzania and in Nigeria, and the bank was financing a major urban infrastructure project, actually putting in a canal to take dirty water out. But it led to huge issues because some of the people were relocated and they were very close to where the bank project was. The bank project ended at a certain area. The canal was right next to it, so we got a lot of flack for people because they were being evicted. And all of this makes instant headlines because people being uprooted from their homes through bulldozers and through armed guards and so forth is very, very easy to get into the media and so forth. So I barely sleep is what happens. The 10-point program, again, Cynthia, this is also one of the most detailed analysis that has been done. It basically talked about what is needed in terms of the diagnostic to secure land governance. And it came up with these 10 points, as I said, 4.5 billion, 10-year security on communal lands, registration of individual lands, increasing access and tenure, developing capacity, resolving land disputes. The courts are clogged across Africa with land disputes. And so that remains one of the issues of increasing scope and effectiveness of land use planning, particularly as climate change hits, because climate change is the greatest outlier in terms of how you would redo your infrastructure to make it more climate friendly, the shift to coastal cities, how will you manage that great issue and so forth, improving public land management. And again, what we have seen through the study is that the greatest conflicts have been in post-conflict countries in Africa. 23 out of the 45 countries or so that have experienced conflict are in Africa. And so there's a disproportionate number of countries that face land conflict just because of that. And then, of course, the strengthening of the valuation function. The benefits, and we can't talk enough about this, are easy to see through greater investment incentives and productivity. The direct impact on poverty reduction that we would achieve, the dispute resolution and conflict prevention in terms of social cohesion and so forth, those are major issues. Protection and sustainable management of natural resources would occur, and along with decentralized government, with governance, you would achieve the necessary economies of scale and the impact that is needed to make a difference. And as we say, the livelihoods and well-being of about 400 million people depend on how quick this agenda is implemented out in the sphere. I'm nearly running out of time, but just wanted to share some very quick thoughts. I work in public affairs. It's a full-time job. The headlines are always, it's a 24-hour news cycle. The World Bank is literally involved in every sector of the economy, starting off from the macroeconomics all the way to sector performance, to law, to governance, to corruption issues and so forth. So I deal with a lot with public perceptions. Public perceptions of Africa have failed to keep up with stark realities. You could, for example, take the entire land mass of Africa, superimpose on it the land surface of the continental United States, Europe, Australia, Brazil, and Japan, and still have land to spare. That is the Africa of promise that I'm talking about. We did this World Development Report in 2009. I think I might have used this picture before, but this is a picture of how Wall Street or markets look at Africa. Were it not for South Africa and Nigeria, the entire continent would disappear. That's how markets view. Things are changing. We now even have The Economist, which says Africa is rising. The McKinsey report, Lions on the Move, talks about Africa's promise. And as if on cue, even the World Bank talks about Africa's rise. So we are facing an amazing opportunity there. I've also used this, slide earlier, but as in the case of the Green Revolution, as with any development intervention, you do have issues that arise of equity. We do know from the Green Revolution that technology is not scale or effect neutral. It was wealthy farmers that benefited first. They were the early adopters. The small farmers came much later, right? We do know that technology can have impoverishing effects. The elites are usually the first to benefit, but and that it can exacerbate inequality. But what we say is that there are no universal solutions, but there are universal processes, accountability, good governance, and participation that can pave the way for local solutions. That is one of the ways in which we can achieve this transformation of the agribusiness sector, put in secure Africa's land for a more prosperous future. I thought we won't kill any trees, but all of this information that I've spoken about is on these URLs. So those of you who want access to these reports, those are the URLs from where you can download it on your computers. We might have even saved a tree. I'll leave that on for a few minutes, and then just say that never doubt that a group of small committed individuals can actually change the world. I think if there's enough thinking, if there's enough commitment and so forth, small groups can indeed change the world. And one is inspired by Margaret Mead's quote, which said that, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that has changed the world. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions. Yes.
Compelling. Thanks for the very compelling seminar. We expected that you could have such a compelling seminar based on great experience as well, especially on the recent years in Africa. So thank you for that. There are two things that extract attention and perhaps from all sides. And I would, in fact, like that we may have a chance after this seminar to have a small meeting regarding this perspective in Africa as it deals with the whole world. The fact that you say that there are universal processes, which is impinging on the lagging behind growth of this continent with respect to the rest, which is good governance, accountability. Essentially, the lagging behind infrastructure, institutions, even the cultural, being oblivious of the cultural responses of people, and especially the land tenure, you've actually struck the heart of the matter. And in this respect, I would like to call on a very important challenge that ICRISAT is now facing. And in fact, we are actually addressing this issue in a different way, wherein we always start with a technology entry point. But then we realize that we will not reach our impact point through our technology entry point if we don't go through the market orientation. And of course, we talked about the inclusive markets-oriented development already.
Yes.
And we're challenging ourselves to face a challenge of technology entry point, but making sure that it's oriented in terms of inclusive, that means the poor, and market-oriented development. So I really would like to get your perspective further on how this technology entry point and the market orientation, realizing that actually this is very much still up to this point, even with the billions of dollars that the World Bank is planning to invest. How does this come together?
I expected a tough question like that, so let me try. And you've raised a whole slew of issues, and so let's sort of deconstruct some of them. In terms of the diagnostics on this study, it's very clear. What they're saying is document land, make sure that it's when investments are taken, that they're done in a responsible agri-investment regime, which basically means look at issues of food security, look at issues of access to rights, proper land titling, and make sure that livelihoods are not lost in the process. And again, within that set of issues, there's a whole Ramayana that could be looked at. But in terms of the diagnostics, there are issues of capital, which again remains a defining constraint. The linkages of farmers to markets, and you very rightly put your finger on the pulse by looking at issues of infrastructure. The bank and the African Development Bank did what is called the Africa Infrastructure Country Diagnostic, where we did a major study of 24 African economies, with the exception of South Africa. And there we looked at all the major sectors in terms of roads, water, airports, transportation, irrigation, and all of that. And what we found there was that in terms of linking farmers to markets and so forth, it remains a distant dream. There are anywhere between 2 to 3% of GDP. 2 to 3% of GDP is lost because of bad infrastructure, and that particularly in rural areas which have been bypassed by public investments. We also spoke about irrigation and so forth. Unpacking all of this means, Cynthia, it's a huge issue in terms of how the bank's own investments, how they fit into a country framework, because each country has different priorities. We have a country partnership strategy. So, for example, if a country wants to focus on land governance, they would say that this is a priority that we want to assign, and how can the bank help? That process takes a long time. The average country partnership strategy lasts for anywhere 3 to 5 years. Most likely governments change. Most likely there are issues of, political change and so forth. So what can come out as a prescription very early on in a political context can very quickly lose steam and unravel as time goes on. The point that you were making about, I think, at least on this study, what we were looking at was just to take a very close microscopic look at what was hindering competitiveness, right? And there it was all the things that we basically know about. I mean, there was nothing that was dramatically different other than saying issues of, let's say, on rice in Senegal, they were looking at issues of quality. In Ghana, as I said, the whole issue of distortionary policies in terms of imposing tariffs. On green beans in Kenya, it was the new EU regulations that were looking at saying no to GMO crops and so forth. The big binding constraint there for green beans, exporting of green beans from Rwanda and Kenya and so forth, were very tight airport regulations and the high costs of air freight. So in terms of by taking this value chain approach, what we were doing is looking at the factors that were hindering growth and ultimately competitiveness. I've given you a long-winded answer, and I think I was all over the place, but I think the key there is to rethink those policies and derive lessons of experience from this very detailed diagnostic that says, thou shalt improve your road infrastructure, thou shalt make it easy to ship beans from in well-ventilated corrugated boxes from Nairobi airport all the way to Amsterdam. I mean, that's the kind of analysis that was done, and so forth. And we can talk a little bit more about the policy frameworks and so forth. Yes, I'm delighted. Do join for lunch so we can continue the discussion. Yes, sir.
Several issues.
So it's always better. Why don't we say the name, then maybe use the mic while asking the question? We are also recording this one. Maybe that would be a best practice to capture all these questions very well.
Thank you, Dilip. I am Nagaraj. I am Nagaraj from Markets, Institutions and Policies. So one of the important issues missing in your presentation is relating to mechanization. So the role of mechanization to bring about a lot of changes maybe perhaps at forum level or at micro level, farmers lack incentives for what is called the scaling up or expansion of the activities. That means my question is how to ensure incentives at forum level or micro level for the farming community. And second, it looks like that it's like a conservative agriculture type. There is no depletion of resources in this case. Still there are empty number of resources, no depletion of like water or, so it looks like like a conservative agriculture in this. Uh, maybe maybe they may be conserving resources for the future. In that way, no development, no depletion. That means it is like this one.
Static.
But it is a really, I am wondering, in spite of liberalization and others, why still it has not opened this one changes. So that is the biggest this one mute point for me.
Thank you. I'll take another. Yes, sir.
I'm Madhusudan from MIP. You in your
It's been a while since I left it, Chris, at MIP.
Yeah, market issues and policy.
Okay.
Yes,
Yes, yes.
Because
Got it.
your presentation was more like development economics oriented, so
Yeah.
I hope you will not mind for that.
Sure.
The question you focus on the land tenure system as the heart of the issues. Many other anthropologists, development thinkers have also pointed out, including Bill Clinton earlier in one CNN program also. The issue is more from the large scale agribusiness, but what about the small scale agribusiness? The emphasis is something diluted in presentation. I hope it is also not the bank policy, because there is two different issues: large scale agribusiness, large investment from external, and depending on that plantation development that took place 40 or before Second World War. Also, that's one type of development. Another development is agribusiness, small scale, like the Haryana, Punjab case here, or less than 4 hectare land, but is successful green revolution took place. So that type of agribusiness, need a different type of focus, different type of things. In your presentation, something, I only get a graph that we're talking about large scale investment only. But the development, the poverty impact may be more because of the multiplier issues, what the John Mellor and other development thinkers have pointed out. Is a large scale development, the multiplier, if you're local, which affect for the poverty elevation, come from the small scale agriculture development, where the vibrant exchange take place within the local market. That thing was not clear, so I would like to get some explanation on that.
Thank you.
I have a question on the same lines. I can add that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, agribusiness potential in Africa, there is a known fact. Thanks for putting figures to that, 3 billion to 1 trillion. So that was great. Problems, a myriad of problems are already there. Just to take his point forward, yes, there are large businesses required. I call them lighthouses so that they can spread value and economics around. But we need these grassroots micro entrepreneurs. I call them fireflies. We need those to scale up. I mean, I've seen a lot of these entrepreneurs doing excellent work, but the way they fail is in scale up. So value of that has been a major problem in a lot of small businesses, and especially so in agribusinesses. So is there something that World Bank is doing on those areas, or even general thoughts on that?
Yeah, okay. Let me come back to that. Let me take one more. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Dilip Kumar from Knowledge Sharing and Innovation. This question is a little different than the questions what the earlier participants asked. Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
It's more related to the ICT and knowledge sharing. So otherwise, after you respond to this one, maybe do I need to keep this?
I'll take
Okay.
yeah, okay. I'll respond to any and all.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm Lydia from the Strategic Marketing and Communication Group. We're talking so much about the constraints to growth, and you have this excellent picture showing where Brazil grew so fast. What are the key factors responsible for their growth? It's the other side of the coin.
Yes. Excellent. Let me, okay, let's take another one and then.
Well, thank you very much, Sarwat, and
Good to see
welcome
you.
back again. Nice to see you, the parent institution. And thanks for you again bringing Chicha also back to the Deepak Pawar, our world alumni here.
I didn't give him a choice, I just roped him in.
The my problem here is, you in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that there's a big rush on land grab in Africa. Looking at the natural resources point of view, and Asia is now a spoiled story in terms of natural resources, in terms of pollution, agriculture, misuse of imports, including pesticide, plant protection. Now, yes, there is a big rush in Africa. People are grabbing millions of hectares and going for big farming, intensive farming, while World Bank is improving by 2030, doubling the irrigation facility. These groups are going to spoil African environment. Are you really aware of these side effects in the next 10 years? Because Africa is one place now, very peaceful, healthy environment, good natural resources. And these type of sudden happenings, over a large scale in Ghana or in Kenya, is that going to, are you looking at the negative effects in the long term? That's what,
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's been a long time since we were on the other sides of a badminton table, but or a table tennis table. But and that point, I think the trade-off between development and environmental protection, I mean, that is an unresolved issue. The whole issue about building inclusive development basically means that you don't compromise your natural resource base, and the whole notion of sustainability is about leaving for future generations as much, or if not more, than what you found. So we'll come to that philosophical question very, very quickly. But the question from Nagaraj was about scaling up. And again, that's no longer a simple question, because what you're looking at is issues of scaling up. You have to have success stories. You have to have the right sets of incentives, the right sets of policies. And then there's also got to be somebody like a flack like me who goes out and tells the story, right? At the bank, we had this major discussion, and we have a major South-South sort of training and learning program. Because what we said was, and especially Jim Kim, the new president, said, I'm going to put in place a regime that does not penalize people for failed projects. He came in at it from a scientist viewpoint, and he said, a failed project is a learning school. What you did wrong there matters hugely, and the whole point is about not repeating it. The macro, the meso, and the micro all kick in. It's about policies at the macro level. At the meso level, you're actually looking at some of those binding constraints that we talked about in the thing. And then at the end of the day, it's all about making the impact at local. Yes, the World Bank is the largest financier and so forth, but we can't do everything, right? So as I said, the big push has been from the countries themselves. At least 20 countries now have put in place, in the past 5 years, have put in place major land laws that recognize these set of issues. So change is happening. It is sometimes slow, and as I said, sometimes it can be reversed through lack of political will and so forth, but change is happening. So the issue of scaling up, yes, as I said, the issues in Ethiopia, in Rwanda, and so forth, these are what Malawi has done in terms of land distribution, remains easily the gold standard on redistributive policies looking at issues of equity and so forth. So there is a wealth of information that is now emerging in the development literature that can help address this. It's not fast enough, I agree with you. It's not broad-based enough, but it's happening. And the point that I was making in my presentation was that if the urbanization trends continue, as African food markets expand, now is the opportunity to get all of these things together so that you can have the souffle doesn't fall apart, but that it all comes together at one point. The question from MIP, that department, that acronym that I missed, issues of large and small scale, right? the value chain approach, I mean, at least certainly on green beans, we were looking at small farmers. There's a very interesting on the website. We interviewed Captain Karanja, who has a local bean distribution company in Kenya. And again, the kind of things that he was talking about were exactly those issues of access to markets, processing and storage facilities, lack of those, the whole issue of technology for harvesting, and so forth. So all of these, it's not an issue of us coming in and saying, or being prescriptive and saying, thou shalt only do large scale, right? Those are all tailored to individual country circumstances and particularly to individual commodities. For example, I discovered all of us eat chocolate, and thanks to Valentine's Day, there's been a global spurt in demand for chocolate. But a cocoa plant has a natural lifespan, and after 7 years, it actually loses its fertility. So there's a whole issue of looking at how you've got to put in place the upkeep and the maintenance and all of that as you start looking at the next 7 years, right? And at least in cocoa, that's one of the things. So it isn't as we're not taking a doctrinaire approach to it, but we do know that when you have economies of scale, technologies come in. We do know that it's the scale of investment matters, but the whole idea is to come up with a range of things that suit those large enterprises, but also not ignoring the needs of small farmers. And again, on these commodities, if you look at rice farming in Senegal, is done on 1 hectare and on 3,000 hectares. So you do have the entire sort of spectrum. And I don't know if I've sufficiently answered that question, but then we had knowledge sharing. Yes, we'll come to that a little bit, yeah? And then the issue of beautiful Africa and how this will. Let me tell you that I've now traveled to over 37 countries in Africa. It remains one of the most beautiful continents on earth. I was telling you about Madagascar. It's absolutely one of the most stunning countries. I was talking to Pat Biddinger, and she said, oh, tell me about one place that I should go to. And I said, try Madagascar. It's the 8th continent on the world, has 5% of the biodiversity on less than 1% of the surface area of the earth. Every tree, every animal, everything that you see is found nowhere on earth, because when Madagascar sheared off from the mainland, that biodiversity went with it, and it remains absolutely one of the most unique places. I take your point about the need to preserve that. We know the costs of development from the Green Revolution on pesticides, as we know, on the whole issue of impoverishment, the whole issue of losing of varieties and so forth. All of those are very potent issues and as still unresolved. Beautiful Africa, yes, but it's changing. And those changes are inexorable. When cities take place, as people move towards cities, I showed you that example from the World Development Report, urbanization is a constant. People are moving to cities. When people move to cities, you have instant slums. Especially, I mean, if you go to Kibera in Nairobi, or you go to large parts of large slums in Ghana, across Africa, these are marring the landscape that you and I know about and celebrate, and indeed the thing. So don't, I'm not in any way undervaluing Africa's lure as a tourist destination. But the point is that if you do not have these mechanisms in place where you put in land titling programs and where people do not feel that they have a right to their lands, we know what happens to commons. When you have collectives, where the environment suffers the most. We do know that. And again, that's not me saying it. The tragedy of the commons remains one of the most compelling debates of our time. The issue about agribusinesses, again, this transformation is taking place. The question is about putting in place the right policies, the right frameworks to help guide that so that your environment is not compromised. It is not an easy task. I mean, China remains one of the most prominent examples of how the environment can be lost in this search for development. But the point about this is that if you put in value-creating technologies, you improve productivity, you use better methods of land management, you use water resources more prudently, you can dull the effects of that thing. And there is a whole growing body of literature that is available on that. Growth in Brazil, absolutely one of the most stunning examples. I used to work with Francisco Reifschneider for over 7 years. Brazil is a success story that has not been written adequately enough, I think. And so is China. I mentioned that very briefly in my presentation. What Brazil did in terms of putting in place the mechanisms for it to become a food superpower, those investments were done 30 years ago. I mean, to give you one example from Brazil on how they have used, Brazil is a world leader on the use of ethanol in gasoline. The use of bio waste and so forth, Brazil has taken it to a fine art. What we tried to do by using corn for ethanol production in 2009 caused the food crisis that we all know about. It's been referenced very widely, where 30 to 40% of the world's corn was diverted for fuel production. And where Amartya Sen, in his very riveting essay, said, the stomachs of hungry people are competing with fuel tanks. But Brazil has done that. And it has done that, and there are actually lessons of experience to learn from Brazil. I did cite the transformation of the Cerrado as being one of the most successful stories that we know about in terms of bringing large uncultivated land into more productive forms of production. So that remains. And I think, again, as I said, I cut my development teeth here. Somebody was talking about China the other day, and the big story is, of course, China and Africa. The whole history of development would have been hugely different if there was greater South-South collaboration. For example, if India had learned from China and we weren't fighting these battles over these line of control and so forth, and actually were working closely with the Chinese in terms of looking at how to improve our own productivity, I think Indian farming would have been hugely different. And so is Brazil, which remains absolute front runner in terms of how they've become a global superpower. I mean, you can't think about soybeans without thinking Brazil. That was a role that was the United States. They have dislodged the United States in that one area where they just powered ahead, did everything that was needed, and they remain legendary in their thing. So that's a good point, but it all leads to the fact that, there wasn't enough South-South, and Dr. Divakar and the others and so forth, when we were having these large training programs. I think that was one of the things that was coming out of this building, was that we were laying the foundations for South-South collaboration there.
I'm glad.
Yes, sir.
You alluded in your presentation about various problems that Africa faces, problems of markets, capital, infrastructure, land rights, and even to add public health, education, and the whole host of others. But I think the basic theme of your presentation was Africa rising, that now that we have had several lost decades in terms of development, but now is the turning point, and Africa is about to rise. My question is, what has fundamentally changed there that you think that Africa will rise? Because from an outside perspective, we know that the rest of the world is eyeing at Africa as an opportunity, land of opportunity, because there are pressures of population and opportunities elsewhere. So it's really obvious that for very reasons, including political reasons, that people are rushing towards Africa as a land of opportunity. And that may trigger some sense of growth, which may be, I think, maybe a false trigger. But my question is, what has fundamentally changed that you think is going to make this happen? And then I have a attendant hypothesis that I would put forward next up once you respond to this.
Oh, this is a conditional question. Double barrel. No. And yeah. Africa Rising, yes. The indicators are clear. Economic growth, sheer size, the issue that I showed you, you could overlay all these other continents and you would still have land to spare. There's also, we are now reaping the rewards of tough reforms that African governments themselves have taken. For example, I mean, the march to democracy, the greater attention that is now being paid to reducing sources of conflict. Our World Development Report on last year was on conflict and development. Again, there are huge strides that are being taken to calm or reduce or dull those factors that actually held Africa back. In terms of the global economy, as I was saying, the sizzling growth rates, all of those simply mean that all of these things are coming together in a virtuous cycle, making it possible to have these doses of optimism. Now, The Economist, as you know, is not one of the most optimistic of newspapers that you can get. And yes, there are huge issues that can actually retard this progress or set us back. I mean, the issues in the Sahel, for example, the problems in Mali, could unravel much of the gains that have been made in large parts of West Africa. The thing there is you really have to keep a focus on the basics. The focus on the basics is thou shalt improve your investment climate. Thou shalt keep your deficit low. Thou shalt invest in people-centered development, agriculture, health, nutrition. Those are the kinds of things that the development literature is replete with, which says that those are what is needed to get you from here to there. What can unravel, as I said, if you look at the issues of Mali that it has faced, the rise of terrorism, we did a report on piracy in Somalia. It is absolutely incredible how much of money the international law prevention agencies put in something like close to $5 billion to protect the world's shipping lanes. And that is just for protecting a fraction of that in terms of merchandise that flows through those things. And I can get you the numbers on that. But what I'm saying is that there's a confluence of events, the benefits of strong reforms and so forth, which have now begun to yield fruit, which gives us hope. I mean, if you can fault the World Bank for being gung-ho on Africa, but McKinsey says it, and as I said, that Dow newspaper that is, which had predicted actually 10 years ago that Africa was the hopeless continent, and it was impossible to govern because of all the corruption and so forth. It did realize its thing and came out with that cover that I showed you about Africa Rising. Now, as I said, I mean, with half the world's uncultivated area waiting to be mobilized, that is by itself a big plus. I mean, it's when you go across, travel by bush plane, and you also use airliners and jets to go over. The amazing thing is about how abundant Africa's land is. And what we are saying is that you now have to grasp the nettle of reforms and put in place the policies and programs that will help make a difference. And agribusiness and agriculture are the entry point for making those deep structural changes that are necessary.
So what you're saying is that there are abundant opportunity in terms of huge unexploited land. But fundamentally, as you alluded towards the end of your presentation in terms of the key pointers of governance
Yes.
and accountability. Now, over the last several decades, why Africa couldn't rise, one of the fundamental reasons to my mind is also the issue of governance, which is also continuing to plague it even as we speak. We talk about Mali or Somalia or other countries. So what I'm trying to get at is that no matter what are the opportunities staring the continent, unless and until the continent sorts out its basic governance issues and political accountability issues, no matter how much progress we make, we will ultimately go back. I mean, we were looking at, putting Iptisat's example, we relocated our regional headquarters from Niger to Mali as a model of good governance, democratic governance in West Africa. And here we are stuck with Mali in what it's doing. So all the gains that we make after lots of effort is undone by a simple one poor governance issue. So that's what basically I'm trying to get at, is that unless this is sorted out, no matter what progress we make elsewhere, this will be a knot.
And that point is well taken, because I think sound governance, whether it is on land or in the way public investments are deployed for purposes, all of that remains a central issue. I mean, you're talking about governance. There's a guy called Mo Ibrahim, whom you must have heard about, who has the Mo Ibrahim index. Mo made his billions selling cell phone bandwidth, and has the Mo Ibrahim Foundation and the Mo Ibrahim governance indicators. It is, and he has a very clever trick. He says, my prize, the annual Mo Ibrahim Prize, will go to an African leader who voluntarily leaves office in the time for which he was elected. It is most likely a he, there's very few she's, and the point about that prize is that it went unclaimed for the past 2 cycles. You could not. So, and I think in that sense, and Mo is a very proud Sudanese individual, one of the leading lights on Africa, and he had a board meeting in Tunis, and we went to the board meeting, and after that he had a party in a stadium for 40,000 people, and Mo was right there with a tray of drinks, serving his board and so forth. But he's that kind of a very hands-on sort of individual. But his prize on governance and so forth actually speaks to that issue. The good news is, Agrawal Saab, that what is happening is that citizens are now stepping in. We now have students in schools reporting that their teachers are absent. We now have patients using cell phones and telling the district medical superintendent that, sorry, I've been waiting here for 45 minutes, no doctor. Please dock his salary for today, right? So, and then as we've discovered in our infrastructure investments and so forth, it's much easier to give the money to the community and say, you build this culvert and you build this bridge and you are responsible for its upkeep, than to give it to somebody in the capital and hope that it will be done and it will be maintained. Where government efforts are failing, citizens are stepping in. And it's largely due to the ICT revolution, which is absolutely bringing about a sea change in the way government accountability is being put to the test. And that would be another fine presentation to give.
I'm Cynthia Bantalan, Dilip, and I have just this question. In just a follow-up to Rajesh, it looks like you have all of this vision reflecting on the World Bank investments. Are you also making sure then, based on your last comment, that the community-driven development, which is a program also driven by the World Bank, is also happening in Africa? Are you ensuring that to happen? Because there's the CDD programs, which is very much in line.
You and I, a few weeks ago, had the privilege of having, Partha was there, we had dinner with Hans Binswanger, who remains the leading guru on community development and leading intellectual in the world and at the World Bank. This is nothing new, Cynthia. I promise you. I'm now counting the 16 years at ICRISAT where I was behind a keyboard and so forth. That may be one thing, but now having looked at development from 20 years on, I can tell you that this is nothing new. I mean, when people are not entrusted with their own development and where they are bypassed in terms of engagement in participatory processes, the outcome cannot be different and cannot be suboptimal. It will be suboptimal. So, I mean, we do know that, and whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in nutrition programs, we do know that people's engagement matters. And of course, it doesn't need the World Bank to say that. Countries know that most fortunately, actually. And so in that sense, yes, communities remain at the center. And as I said, one of the major issues is how do you build those processes of engagement that get them to contribute to what you're trying to achieve. And that can only be done through what I was saying, consultative, transparent, accountable processes that where you're not doing things just for effect or just for visual, but there is actual engagement. And nowhere is this more clearer than in the issues of land titling and so forth, where we have known, I mean, one of the major principles of responsible agro-investment is engaging communities and paying them fair market value if you take their land. And we do know that if that doesn't happen, then the business enterprise, whether it is large or whether it is small, will fail. And as I shared with you Madagascar's example, 5 years on, we are still facing the effects of a wrong investment decision that has unraveled the country and put thousands, if not millions, of people into distress.
We've gone into the lunch break, Sarwat. Thank you very much. But before we wrap up, I want to introduce Dilip.
Hi, Dilip.
Who is the coordinator for the ICRISAT South-South initiative that we're doing with the government of India and Africa. And maybe after lunch, we have time to talk to him because
the best is join for lunch. No, yeah.
He's already committed to inviting a group of us to lunch.
So yeah, please.
We can have this discussion because we have a very pertinent question about this.
Exactly.
And I just wanted to introduce that and we'll...
Yes, absolutely.
But let's give a...
Thank you.